Welcome to Inside the Director Circle and this episode on exploring the canvas of leadership. I'm Jason Langford-Brown, your host, founder of the Director Circle, practicing business advisor and coach and psychologist. Leadership is a big and complex subject, but its importance means we need to cut through this and know where and how to use it effectively. Therefore, this episode coincides with the launch of our leadership canvas, our attempt to simplify but not dumb down the topic, and that was partly inspired by our learnings from the military, along with many other models developed and studied over the years. So it seems appropriate that today's knowledge partner joining us from the Director Circle is Chris Carter, MBE. Chris is now spending his time leading major projects for engineering consultancy in Jaya Arup, including HS2 and more recently the Birmingham Commonwealth Games. But I suppose why Chris is really here today is a former colonel and commanding officer of the British Army. Chris has also delivered leadership development to other armed forces across the globe and teaches to officers at the British Army's Defence Academy. And as always, we want to bring a practical element to the discussion. So I'm delighted today to also welcome Joe Williams, CEO of the Royal Orthopaedic Hospital NHS Trust. I think it's fair to say Joe is seen as a pretty progressive leader in the NHS, and that's probably reflected in the high performance of the ROH, one of the highest performing trusts in the UK. So welcome to you both. And just before we move on, just very quickly, remember this is just a snapshot of what happens inside the business leader community. So if you want to get more involved or access further insight, visit directors-circle.com and click join the community button. So to get us off today, Chris, if I can come to you to start with, I just wanted to, start with something that really resonated with me when I did some work with you at the Army a few years ago. And we spent a lot of time looking at, the military stuff that you'll be very familiar with, but also many, many other models. We were hoping to come up with a really simple three-circle Venn diagram, as all management consultants would like to have, to really cut through this. But we kind of quickly discovered that leadership isn't that straightforward, which is why we ended up with a canvas. But what was really interesting was we managed to build our canvas around three core components, which is what leaders are, what leaders know, and what leaders do, which is, I know, very much at the heart of the Army leadership model. And however hard we tried, whatever model we looked at, whatever theory we kind of studied, we could not pin it back to those three core elements. So I thought it'd be great just to start today with just getting your thoughts on, how powerful was that for you when you were back in the Army? How did it help you? And does it still resonate? And have you sort of taken that into the more commercial world and the world more generally?
Yeah, definitely. So within the British Army, clearly leadership has been a subject of great study and analysis for decades, and indeed centuries. But it's only really in the last 15 or so years that the Army has taken steps to really bring together its learning and in common everyday language set out simple frameworks and guides for its leaders, all the way from general to lance corporal or indeed private soldier, to apply in their everyday working lives. And this has really opened up the subject, taking it away from a subject of some mystique into something really practical that all of us can embrace and work to improve ourselves and others' sort of abilities in this field. And instrumental to that, I think, has been the development of the Leaders Are, Leaders Know and Leaders Do model, recently updated with some additional practicalities on how leaders go about their day-to-day business as well, and that's been an eye-opener, not only in terms of developing what your own leadership practice and leadership capabilities, but communicating with others with regards to what good leadership looks like, and enabling and supporting others in the development of their own leadership practice.
So is it what I'm hearing? It's kind of made it a bit more tangible and a bit easier to sort of tag things too, because there's so much to talk about in leadership, isn't there, really?
Yeah, and I think we can, particularly in the military, we can be guilty of setting a very, very high bar in terms of leadership discussion. So we'll go straight to the Duke of Wellington or Field Marshal Slim or some of the great British military leaders, or indeed sort of international leaders, and that's a great vehicle for learning, but for the majority of us who are kind of middling average leaders trying to improve our own practice and our own abilities, or find ourselves a technical expert who's been given a leadership position and having to get to grips in pretty short order with the subject leadership, that does set a very, very high bar in terms of aspiration, and doesn't necessarily give you the kind of tools to develop yourself and to understand what good leadership looks like and what it feels like.
Great, yeah. So Joe, just to bring you in on that part of the conversation, is that, as a leader, is that, and obviously having lots of leaders working for you, is that a challenge for you? Sort of that common language, that simplicity of tools, did that resonate with you from what Chris was saying there?
It's fascinating. I could listen to Chris all afternoon, actually. It's really interesting in terms of the contrast. So I would say probably from 23 years in the NHS, we haven't gone to figureheads, or we haven't gone into history to look at who good leaders are, because I think the NHS has struggled with that in the past. I think if I think through my career, I think I had very limited support and management in terms of what good leadership looked like. It was more a kind of who inspired me in terms of working, what did a good chief exec look like when I was working in different parts of the NHS. But I think for us, not only has leadership now come into the fold in terms of NHS about actually what good leadership looks like, the interesting bit for us now is about compassionate and authentic, which you would think should be kind of motherhood and apple pie in the NHS. But I think it's only now where, if I think of some of the things that I communicate out now, even 5-10 years ago, it would be frowned upon me in terms of how I was being authentic, and how, you shouldn't be seen to lead in that way.
Yeah, that's really interesting you say that, Joe, and I think part of your progressiveness is your authenticity, and you're right. I think actually some of the things that you do from an authentic position, you're probably right, would be seen as almost a sign of weakness. So maybe this is we're not going to cover the whole canvas today, but in the R section of the canvas, we talk about, one thing that leaders definitely are is authentic in style. And I always separate that out, I think, from the skill of, maybe you'd call it adaptive leadership, the ability to flex your style, which I think is a skill that leaders need to have. But for me, it's a skill. But I think what you actually are at your core is, you are authentic. So it's really interesting. You both talk about what good leadership looks like. So I'm wondering, is there a bit of a paradox there? We're looking for what good leadership looks like. We're also saying you need to be authentic. Chris, do you have a view on that?
I don't think they're a paradox. I think within the military, and this is entirely in line with other professions and occupations. In a leadership position, you're very open to observation and scrutiny, and therefore not being authentic, not being yourself, or the best version of yourself. Perhaps might be another way of putting it. Is very quickly apparent to those you work with and those that you lead, that you're not being, that you are being inauthentic, and there's a lack of integrity and a degree of truth to your actions and behaviours, and that comes across very readily and is very apparent. You are under huge spotlight in any leadership position, and I think what resonates with people is that authenticity, you being you, the best version of yourself, acting in accordance with good leadership practice, but being yourself, and I think that is true in many professions, not least of which the military.
Yeah. I think I tend to resonate with that, just because I think what good leadership looks like. One of them definitely is authenticity, and so it's not about being like somebody else, it's being you. But I think the bit I pull out of that, you talked about integrity, and the word that popped into my head was trust. I think even at a subconscious level, if you aren't authentic, people, they almost smell it, and so they don't trust you. And if people don't trust you, it's probably hard to be a leader. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mentioned Field Marshal Slim earlier. He was the British general who took command of the army in the Far East in the early 40s, having been comprehensively beaten by the Japanese forces. And it was a disparate multinational army. It was at the end of a very, very long supply chain from the UK, which was under huge pressure in the early 40s itself, and called itself the Forgotten Army, and it was very much a beaten army. And Slim transformed the army very much through personal leadership and example, and being an authentic leader. He's well known within the military for in the event of any of the organisations within his army, being cut off from supply and being on short rations, he put his own army headquarters on half rations, just to emphasise to all in the headquarters that they weren't going to eat properly until everyone within the army was eating properly. And he very famously said that leadership was a projection of personality, and it was the most personal thing in the world. And the phrase that's so often repeated when people speak about Slim's views on leadership was, because leadership is just plain you. And I think in the 40s, that speaks very, very clearly to the topic of authentic leadership, which Joe's already mentioned.
Yeah. So I'm just before we move on to slightly different subjects, I'm conscious of time today, but I think that notion of what good leadership looks like is it looks like you, I think is really, really powerful. But Joe, just practically for you, what difference are you seeing day to day with your teams by, when you were maybe less authentic in the past, because that's how you were expected to be, versus how you're now being much more authentic? What practical difference is it making for you in a day-to-day running of the organisation?
I guess at the opportunity of becoming the chief exec, which is 3.5 years ago now, COVID started as well in the organisation. So it was a good opportunity, although I was not new to the organisation, I was new into this role. So it's the point that Chris made. People wanted to know, they wanted to know about me in terms of my decisions, where it was going to come from. So, can they trust this person? Because we're into something really scary. We don't know what it's going to look like. We're frightened. So they've got to be able to trust what I say, and also know that there's only, it's that there's one version of you. So my decision making and the way I approach things, there's not a Joe behind the scenes and a Joe that's front facing. So I think it is important. They know you're going to make hard decisions, and it's how you back them up, isn't it? About actually, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to do it, and we're going to do it together. And I think what's nice, so what I write out, it's the hardest piece of work that I do every week, and I write out a start of the week. It normally ends up being the end of the week most weeks, but I write out something that's happened either in the week, about the week, or something that's happening around in terms of global, whether it's cost of living. And actually what's really lovely now is that I hear staff say, well, this is what Joe would say, this is what Joe would decide, and this is we know her values. And I had somebody who emailed me last week who I don't know, who had seen something, they wanted to praise somebody, and they had a discussion in the office to say, we know you're a fair, authentic and kind leader. And I thought that was just really nice for somebody that I'd never met, but clearly the way that I've tried to be authentic, they knew that they were safe to email me, but also that they knew in terms of my values, which was, I don't think they realised just how much that one email meant, really.
No, that's really powerful, Joe. And I think that's really interesting as well, because as you become a leader of a big organisation, it's impossible to touch everybody, but through that authenticity, you're reaching more people. I think that's a really interesting piece of insight for me from there. Chris, were you going to jump in on that?
I mean, that sounds fantastic, and that feedback from a colleague, saying those words, I think is tremendously powerful. And within the military sort of version of the know and do model, we talk about the leader as setting the example and being the champion of defined values and standards within the organisation. So the British Army, like many organisations, has defined its values and standards, which aren't necessarily too different from what you might expect in an organisation such as an NHS trust, for example. I mean, they're the good sort of common sense values of doing the right thing in the right way, but very much the leader being that that champion of values and standards, and consistent and fair application, etc., etc. So people know what to expect, and they can buy into that, and they know it's we've said it previously. It's the authentic version of the leader. It's the authentic version of the organisation in question.
Yeah, and it's that I know we shamelessly stole the Know Do from the army as part of our Canvas baseline, because we said we couldn't get away from everything pinned into it, whichever model we looked at. But the champions of the standards and behaviours is something else we shamelessly took with us, because we just thought it was way too powerful. And I think Joe's example is a really good reason why that needs to be part of what leaders are. I just wanted to about what to expect. And you mentioned earlier in the podcast, Joe, about compassion. And in the do part of the Canvas, we talk about part of what leaders need to do is provide support, which kind of sits around the notion that they need to achieve something with individuals and with teams. But I think you've hit on something here that I think in the modern age, providing support has got a lot more serious than it used to be. Not just putting your arm around somebody, but actually showing compassion. Lots of conversation around psychological safety now. Because I think if people, and I think this is what you're getting through your authenticity, if people are frightened from within, from their own leaders, really, really hard to focus on what we should be doing. So I'm just interested from your perspective how that compassion part has evolved. Are you embracing things like psychological safety? Are you seeing people perform better because they're not fearful of their leaders squashing them, shall we say?
So I guess we started something that we called the ROH Wellbeing Hospital, which shameless are completely made up. And somebody said to me, what does that look like? And I said, we're in the healthcare business, but we have to look after the people who provide healthcare to patients. And you can see that through the quality of care. So we started on some small things. So we started on actually understanding, given that my makeup of workforce is predominantly females. So we started on the menopause, and then we started on hidden disability. And then we talked about Be Myself. So it's that about knowing that, we know that people, I always talk about people turn up at work in the car and they don't just leave all the problems in the car, whether that's cost of living, whether that's caring for an elderly relative, whether that's it's that onion, all the different layers of the individuals. What we've said to them is come into work as yourself, bring everything with you, and we will work with you to say, how can we help you? Because you are a person. And what we've then done is then set up different groups. And what's been fantastic is that actually those groups have been created by staff. So staff have gone out. Most recently, we've done something called Mankind, which is all around supporting. We know that male colleagues struggle in terms of talking to each other, whether that's through health, whether that's mental health, whether that's physical health, whether that's bereavement. So I've said, right, we need to think about how we support our male colleagues. The next thing I know, they've got a group, they've got a logo, they've got they've already. So I think, but then if you set that framework, you've then got to give them the support to know that you're going to help them with it. So what we've then done is we've tried to make sure we do the support and we don't just go straight for the policies and procedures, because if people feel confident and open that they can explain when they're struggling, we shouldn't need them going into, to disciplinaries and poor performance, because we know people don't don't come into work to say, how can I do a rubbish job today? There are other things that are going off, and it's how we can support them with that.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, Jo. As you were talking there, it resonated with me as well when we do emotional intelligence, which we know is another high factor for what leaders are. That I think in the old days it was don't bring your emotions to work, as if but it's impossible, isn't it? Our emotions ebb and flow every minute of the day, So I think that notion of it's there, we have to accept it's there, bring it with you, and then we'll deal with it. That's a really interesting notion. I suppose, Chris, just to be a bit Neanderthal for a second, in my head I'm thinking this all sounds a bit woolly for the army. Where does compassion, psychological safety, and all the things Jo's talk about sit in a military situation?
I think the reality is that there's always had a place within military leadership. We're talking about that the whole individual comes to work, as Jo says, and whether you like it or not, that's what comes to work. And if you want to get the best out of your people, if you want to demand the highest levels of performance and concentration and commitment in the most demanding of circumstances, you've got to develop the individual. You've got to build the individual, support the individual. That is the basis of good teams and the basis of good performance. And so I think that's always been part of military leadership. It hasn't been as explicit in the sense of how the military is evolving in terms of better managing its people and looking after wider needs. But I think the military is improving in that explicit articulation of that requirement. And there's a very simple example in terms of the motto of the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, where the Army trains its young leaders, and that is serve to lead, and that's been the motto of that organisation since 1945, when it was founded in its current form. And that is ingrained into young trainee officers, that they are there to serve their soldiers in order to perform their duty. And looking after the whole individual, I think, is very much part of that.
I think it's another example, Chris, where the myth and the belief of how the army behaved in the past is often very different to the truth. And I think that's one I've not heard before, but another example of where actually some of this stuff actually has been there for a long, long time in the army, despite the fact that some of the myths that go around have been very, very different. So just wanted to say, conscious of time, and wanted to just touch on one last subject before we finish this episode today, which is around the area of leadership. Leaders know we know stuff around they need to be able to lead themselves, lead others. Obviously, they need a whole bunch of leadership skills, which in itself is a huge subject. But I think the one that often creates a lot of debate when I'm talking to leaders is this notion of being able to lead the thinking. Because I think many leaders go into leadership thinking they need to be the biggest brain, have all the ideas, come up with all the answers. And we talk a lot about leading thinking often is about helping others to come up with all the right answers and get the best thinking from the group. Chris, maybe just get you to maybe put your spin on that. And is there something in the army that is driven around that concept? I think we've lost Chris. Chris is back. Sorry, Chris.
No, I'm still here. I think once again, this is something that's been in practice for many years, if not made explicit, but certainly made explicit now. And this is the idea of the leader, who in a military context is could be one of the younger members at the most junior level, could be one of the sort of younger members of a 30-person group called a troop or platoon. And a 21-year-old second lieutenant or lieutenant is in charge of this group of people. And within this group, you've got a huge amount of experience and expertise and outputs of training and so forth. And within the development of young officers, we emphasize the importance of seeking advice, opinion from your command, taking the best of those ideas, synthesizing a plan, and then delivering the plan. And the officer's job is to own the plan, to deliver the plan, to monitor, evaluate, and keep performance on track. But in terms of forming the plan, it is to seek advice and experience from all available sources. And we don't expect the officer or the young leader to know everything, but we do expect them to have an approach that draws in this knowledge and experience, develops a cohesive, workable plan, and then executes the plan as required.
You just reminded me, Chris, when I was working with some of your team, probably 10 years ago now, when we brought some business leaders into the army for some sessions, and we were doing a task, and I know that one of your mantras in the team performance of the army about disagreement is good, which is something I think we use in team performance generally. But the task was kind of given by the officers, and everyone just said, "Yeah, we'll do that." And they actually said, "No, we're not doing anything until you go away and actually have some debate and challenge some of the thinking we've given you." So it was almost like they wouldn't even let them continue until there'd been some of that kind of group thinking and group debate, which I thought was a really good example of what you've just said in action.
Yeah, we have a number of defined processes for developing plans at various levels and using various organisations within a military task organization, and throughout those plans we have in effect a wargaming approach at various key gateways. So the gateway review is in effect a wargaming where we test the plan and we challenge the plan and we subject it to sort of different inputs, and we encourage the red teaming approach, which is chucking in curveballs and and various challenges to make sure that we've got the best plan, most comprehensively thought out as possible, and we have considered all the various contingencies, and that openness to challenge, I think, is most important.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting that you've actually got very deliberate tactics to actually force that as well, which I think is really, really interesting. So, Joe, just from your perspective, how do you find this notion of kind of, you leading the thinking as opposed to doing all the thinking? Is it something you do? Is it a challenge for you in a non-military environment to get people around you kind of doing the thinking as a group?
So I suppose given that my role here was a chief operating officer before, there was a lot of work that I did in terms of actually setting that direction and boundaries about how we wanted, setting that vision about what we wanted to get to. What I've found in the last, so I'm coming up for nearly 6 years now and 3.5 as chief exec, what I've found is that actually I don't have to direct anymore, which is great, because people know that they can see, they know the framework in which they can perform, very much like Chris described, really, the framework, and they don't have to ask for permission. But it is so linked to culture. The people have got to know that, that I always say to them, try not to look. I think, you look at management and people visually look up, and it's kind of, the exec team do not have all the answers. So I think it's just dispelling that myth to say, actually, you see it day in, day out. We can probably do very little about today, but you can do something about tomorrow. So what is it that you can do? There's clearly some learning in terms of, we tend in the NHS to just let's get it in and have a go and just hope it works, and then we'll have a look at it. Was probably some from Chris and the team about actually how we test it, because I think at times there's something about actually let's just have a go. And COVID has taught us that as well. We took down all the boundaries for COVID and said we're dealing with something really new. We don't know whether it's going to work. We're going to have a go, and it's okay if it goes wrong, because we do live in that fear at sometimes about, what if it goes wrong? So we have set that framework to say, if you have a go at something and it doesn't work, it's okay.
Yeah, and I think it's some, Joe, just to wrap up today, I think it's definitely some authenticity there in terms of, admitting we don't have all the answers. I think then empowering people to go away and think for themselves, and then giving that psychological safety to make mistakes. That probably encompasses a number of things we've already talked about today. So that was, thank you for that. So just to wrap up this episode, if I was to say, if you had to give the leaders out there, just one piece of advice as a leader, what would it be? Let me just finish off with one. What would be your number one piece of advice as a leader that you'd give to leaders listening to this episode? Joe, do you want to kick us off?
I would say stop looking left and right and look straight ahead, because you just need to be your authentic self, and it's enough. Great.
Chris?
Lead others in the way that you would expect to be led yourself.
Great. Thanks, Chris. And I think for me, I mean, so many good insights from today. I'm not going to summarize them all, but I think that kind of notion that what good leadership looks like is actually you, I think it's a really powerful thing to take away for people from today. So thank you, Chris, Joe. In the next episode, Chris and Joe are going to join us again, and we're going to actually look at some leadership lessons from the military, things that hopefully Chris has learned that still resonate out here in the outside world. But in the meantime, if you want more information on this subject, reach out to us at directors-circle.com, or you can reach out to one of our knowledge partners, Lucid, who own the Leadership Canvas, and I'd be more than happy, I'm sure, to explore this so into more detail with you. But in the meantime, thank you for listening to Inside the Director Circle.